DVB, Digital Fast.
Hello and welcome to the DVB Newsroom. I'm your host Nora. Joining me today is Jared Bissinger, a visiting fellow with the Myanmar Studies Program at the Institute of Southeast Asia Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute. He is also the research lead at Catalyst Economics. Thank you for being here today, Jared.
Thanks for having me.
Your latest report is called "The Energy Crisis is Hitting Myanmar Hard." What immediate effects have become evident?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's probably a number of things that people can see very clearly. Obviously, fuel prices have increased significantly. That is, of course, not just something you see in Myanmar, but that's something you see around the world. And then, obviously, just as a consequence of that, transportation prices, bus tickets, cost of flights, all of these things have increased pretty significantly. And then there's also, there's shortages of fuel. Simply the amount of fuel available to buy globally is down. Countries in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, are hit pretty hard because they're amongst the most dependent in the world on Middle Eastern fuel. Myanmar's a big fuel importer, so, it's really hit Myanmar in that way. You see things like long queues to get fuel. You see, things like farmers reporting an inability to access fuel, and then just things like canceled flights, canceled bus trips, those types of things. So, a number of pretty evident and obvious effects of the fuel crisis that you're seeing even now.
Which impact showed up first in Myanmar, like higher prices or shortages or transport disruption?
Well, I mean, you're seeing all of them. It's tough to sort of quantify and say, oh, this is the one that's the most significant. And of course, they're related. The prices have gone up because the quantity has gone down. So, yeah, this sort of all come together.
How do you view the regime in Naypyidaw's response to the energy crisis so far?
Yeah, well, we can talk about a few of the things they've done. Some of these are like launching an odd even system for driving, trying to use QR codes as a tool to ration fuel, using a mileage-based system to ration fuel, doing tax exemption on diesel. All in, I would say the things that have been done so far are limited. But in a way, the regime is sort of, it's constrained by its own policies and its own priorities. And that limits what it can and will do to respond to this crisis. So what do I mean by that? When you talk about the regime's policies, one of them is the big fiscal deficit. Myanmar runs a big budget deficit. That doesn't really leave a lot of room to provide subsidies in an instance like this. Yes, I guess Myanmar could, but then it would just involve, running an even bigger budget deficit that would be financed by printing money, which would drive inflation. Another one of the policies here that has a big effect is the foreign exchange policies. And these policies tend to reduce the amount of foreign exchange that comes to Myanmar. They undermine export industries. They discourage people from bringing foreign exchange back to Myanmar. Because they have to change it at unfavorable rates. And so it reduces the total amount of foreign exchange available. And in an environment where the price of fuel has gone up and it's become a lot more scarce, Myanmar just doesn't have that much more money to go out and try to buy additional fuel. And then when I talk about the regime's priorities, obviously, those are military priorities. The regime is prioritizing military over civilian uses of fuel. And, that constrains what they can and will do for the civilian economy. Mm-hmm. One other thing I think is important to mention is that the regime is relying pretty heavily on administrative controls as opposed to market mechanisms. And so what that means is, if you want access to fuel, like there was a news story a few days ago about farmers who want fuel, who have to, they have to get approval from the township agriculture department after submitting a bunch of information, and then they can get permission to buy fuel. it's an administrative mechanism. It's not a market mechanism. It's not that the prices have gone up and then consumers make their own decisions about whether they buy fuel or not. This is an administrative decision. And, one of the things you often see resulting from that is a growth in black markets. People who have access to fuel then resell it. And that's why one of the reasons why the black market price of fuel in Myanmar is so much higher than the, kind of the regulated price.
What does their response revealed about the regime's economic priorities?
Well, I think it shows that, their priorities are conflict and political, not really the economy. They're going to and are prioritizing military uses. It's not like they've, dramatically cut airstrikes or troop mobilizations or any of those things. And so, if the military wants access to fuel, they generally get that. And that just means there's less available for the civilian economy. So I think it's just further evidence of priorities that, you've seen for years, but this is just additional evidence of that.
How is this crisis impacting farmers and factory workers in Myanmar?
Well, let's start with farmers. Obviously, fuel prices have gone up. One of the other things that has really gone up in price is fertilizer. Fertilizer also is, it's made with natural gas as a key sort of ingredient for that. And fertilizer prices, at least the last time I saw, was up, somewhere around 80%, which it's dramatic. I mean, that's just a huge increase. And of course, they're both getting tougher to get. Myanmar did purchase quite a bit of fertilizer from the Middle East. And so, now there is significant concern that farmers will be using less fertilizer, and that's potentially going to have an effect on the yield of crops. So the WFP just came out with a sort of a report, and they basically said, this is a significant risk that a 50% cut in fertilizer use, that could reduce rice yields by 10 to 15%, and that could have a significant effect on prices. And this is coming on the back of what, for at least rice farmers, was a pretty difficult year in 2025. Rice farmer profits were lower than they'd been in previous years, in part because rice prices globally fell. But, it wasn't a good year for rice farmers. Profits weren't great. Perhaps the one thing that might help farmers is if rice prices go up, and that is very, very likely, that farmers will benefit from that. If rice prices go up, then farmers who grow rice are going to get more money. And so that could offset some of the negative things that farmers are experiencing. Factory workers, they're sort of on the other end of that. They are buyers of rice and all other food products. So if food prices go up, that tends to be bad for sort of your urban working class. There's also a number of other ways in which kind of factory workers could get hurt. There's risks of disruptions in supply chains. Myanmar has a very big garment industry, and there's big risks that there are disruptions in that industry, whether it be transportation, whether it be raw materials. Quite a few fabrics and other raw materials in the garment industry are, they rely on petroleum products. And then there's also risks around, say, the lack of diesel to power factories. If factories cannot get access to diesel, then they can't run generators. And so they may have disruptions there. And those things all, they create risk for workers. So look, there's risks both for farmers and for factory workers. Just the economy as a whole.
Could this deepen the food insecurity as well as the job insecurity?
Yeah. I definitely think it will worsen food insecurity. And in fact, that was a key point of that WFP article that just came out, is that this really is going to worsen what already is, a pretty bad situation for food insecurity. The 2025 humanitarian needs and response plan for Myanmar had over 20 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. For 2026, the number was 16 million, but that's only because they stopped counting the other 5 million who still need that same level of humanitarian assistance. So there's huge needs. And this is probably going to worsen that.
As you have mentioned in your report, Naypyidaw is prioritizing fuel supplies for the military over civilian use. How are they doing this?
Well, the military controls the financial infrastructure, the money that is used to purchase imports of fuel. They control, in some cases, the physical infrastructure. There have been numerous reports over the last few years about kind of the military's role in the supply chains for fuel and how they control key points or can access fuel at key points throughout those supply chains. Fuel depots are, under the control of the military, or the military has preferential access to get fuel from those depots if and when they choose. And again, this isn't based on, price. If they want access, they get access. So it's not a market-based system. It is very clearly a two-tier system. And of course, the military has this sort of power because, at least in the area where you have a lot of the fuel infrastructure, which is in and around Yangon, the military has the military power to, gain access to that whenever it needs.
What does this mean for the hospitals or transport operators, factories, and households?
I mean, look, it means they get what's left. Yes, there will be fuel supplies available for civilian uses, but it's going to be less than would otherwise be the case if there wasn't an ongoing conflict in Myanmar. And again, that's going to worsen shortages. That's going to result in more cancellations, more price increases, and all sorts of negative implications for the civilian population.
Since the 2021 military coup, Myanmar has been hit by one crisis after another. How can the economy withstand this?
Well, I think it's important to note that the economy really has struggled since 2021. It declined a lot that year and really hasn't rebounded in any significant degree, and certainly not where Myanmar could have been without the coup and without the effects of COVID. If you look at some of the key measures of how the economy is doing and how people in Myanmar are doing, they really show, just how tough the last 5 years have been. Poverty has at least doubled at this point. Migration has spiked. Many, many millions of Myanmar people have left the country. Real wages or inflation-adjusted wages have declined in some areas pretty significantly. So, it's really been, a challenge, and it's, the negative effects of this have been borne by the country's population. That's not to say that there aren't some signs of resilience. There's definitely some resilience. There's also some degree of stability. But, overall, the economy is in a much more vulnerable place than it was, compared to before the coup. I think it's worth pointing out that, this is not sort of a crisis per se. What's happened in the last 5 years is not a crisis. The recent events with the war in Iran and the energy crisis, that is a sort of a crisis in the way we traditionally think about it. It's an external event. It's probably going to be temporary. What Myanmar has experienced post-coup is really the effects of economic policies that have caused so much of the country's economic decline. These aren't policies that are going away. Almost all of them are still in place. This isn't something that's temporary. This isn't a crisis that's just going to pass one day. What you're seeing in Myanmar now is the result of those policies. Obviously, the fuel crisis is on top of that, and the effects of that are going to be significant. They're going to be felt realistically for years. But it's important to differentiate that the effects that we see from the crisis in the Middle East now they will likely be temporary, whereas the effects we see from the regime's economic policies could last for a long time.
You mentioned the crisis-induced inflation in your report. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, it's just the inflation that's going to come from this energy crisis. So we already see the direct effects. Fuel prices now are 50% higher. Fertilizer prices are 85% higher. And, that right there is that is inflation. But then this translates through to many other things. So higher fuel prices then means higher bus fares and higher plane fares and higher delivery costs and logistics costs. It means higher food prices. So it trickles through to many other things. Another way that it can affect it is by making goods scarce. So, if you look at black market prices of fuel, those have gone up a lot because fuel is so scarce that people will pay a real premium just to get access to it. And so, that's another way in which the crisis can really create inflation.
Why does that combination hit Myanmar harder than any other countries?
Well, I don't know if I could say it's hit Myanmar harder than any other country, but it's certainly hit Myanmar hard because of that dependence on the Middle East, because of the kind of inward-looking economic policies, because of the relatively small amount of foreign exchange available, the ongoing conflict. All of these things kind of come together to create a pretty significant effect in Myanmar compared to most other places.
What are the long-term effects of this energy crisis on Myanmar?
Well, it's a dynamic situation. It's still too tough to say for certain, but I think we can be pretty confident that we're going to see higher food prices. It's already starting, but really has the potential to hit later this year and into next year. We could see considerable growth in food prices for quite some time. We can see disruption in supply chains. And this can affect all sorts of inputs. Anything that depends on energy, that depends on petroleum products. So, anything plastics, any chemicals, even in the garment sector, there's a lot of synthetic fabrics that have petroleum products in it. And so you can get shortages of raw materials. And if you don't have fabrics, then factories can't operate. So there's a lot of risk of knock-on effects that they're not going to hit in Myanmar for months or years, but they could have an effect. Beyond that, I think you see things like you see risks like reduced investment. Businesses are probably a number of businesses in this time are going to be really struggling. They're going to have lower profits. They're going to be less likely to invest. I think there's also the risk of some business closures, and all of these things could have longer term effects. So it is a dynamic situation, but I think that the long term effects are going to be kind of numerous, and we're going to be seeing them for some time.
What are the risks of poverty, migration, and humanitarian need over time?
Well, the risks for poverty are significant. It's likely that it will cause an increase in poverty and therefore humanitarian needs. It depends on what happens with, rice prices. Myanmar is, a heavily agricultural country. If you see a significant growth in world rice prices, Myanmar may benefit from that. That might help to offset some of the negative effects. But, there are still major risks with input prices having gone up so much. And, people in Myanmar, they may not even have access to credit to be able to invest so that they can benefit when rice prices go up. So, there's a lot of challenges that I think are going to come together, but certainly increased poverty and increased humanitarian need are likely.
For those interested in learning more about Myanmar's economy since the coup, what are you working next?
Yeah, so a few things. I've just gotten done writing an article. It's a very short article, just a couple pages, about basically the approach that the military regime has taken with the currency and basically overvaluing the Myanmar kyat. If they were to let it freely float, it would probably, probably have a lower value. It would probably depreciate. But this approach has some really negative long-term implications. It tends to hurt exporters. It tends to help importers. And over the long run, it sort of undermines the export-oriented parts of the economy and the parts of the economy that generate foreign exchange. And this is actually kind of the opposite of what the military has said they want to do, but then they have this policy of overvaluing the exchange rate that has that effect. So, it's actually quite a contrast with a country like China that's sort of long taken steps to try to undervalue their currency. So it's sort of an interesting contrast and one where, there are some long-term potential effects. So I just wanted to write about that so that people could kind of understand, where this could lead in 5, 10, 20 years. I've also got another article coming out about Financial Action Task Force in Myanmar. And, this basically looks at the regime's attempts to sort of work on various aspects of the work plan laid out by the Financial Action Task Force. One of the big things that they've done post-coup is to try to, sort of quote unquote clamp down on money laundering. But they've done this through, in part, going after hundies. The challenge or the issue is that hundies often are involved in moving money for informal trade, for migrants. But there's a big question as to, the degree to which they are the real problem when it comes to money laundering. The same military back in 2008 told the Financial Action Task Force that hundies were legitimate. And now here they are 20 years later saying, oh no, hundies are the problem. They're laundering money. And basically the argument is the regime is doing this not because they want to address money laundering, but because they want to push everyone to use the official system and the banks so that they can get the foreign exchange coming into the country. So it's not about combating money laundering. It's about controlling foreign currency. Another article that I've done is looking at humanitarian assistance and basically how economic policies are a key driver of growing humanitarian needs in Myanmar. That yes, of course, there's conflict, and that is a big driver of humanitarian needs. Also, the earthquake last year created some humanitarian needs. But there are also literally millions of people in parts of Myanmar that have not been significantly affected by conflict or the earthquake that are in need of humanitarian assistance. So in Irrawaddy, there were between Irrawaddy and Yangon, there were, I think it was 3.7 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. And that's primarily driven by economic policies, not by conflict, not by the earthquake. And so the point of the article is to say that, actually, this isn't about an economic crisis. This is about policies that are going to stay in place, and they're going to keep creating humanitarian needs as long as they're there. And so, I think the point of that is to try to get people to think a little bit more about what the long-term prospects of humanitarian assistance are, and whether there's also a need to think more about development-oriented programming. And then last, I'm doing a report on the economic war against the Myanmar military, looking at the ways in which resistance actors have tried to prevent the military from accessing foreign currency and other revenue sources, and to look at what has worked and what hasn't worked, and to try to provide some sort of summary and context about how, despite sanctions and many other tools, the military has been able to afford a greater number of airstrikes and many other, quite expensive types of combat in more recent years. So why have they been able to do that despite all of these sanctions and other steps by the international community? And basically the argument is that, that once the military took control of the state, they basically gained power over state institutions to create and control money. And that those state institutions, the central bank, are far more lucrative than MEHL. And in fact, the historical importance of MEHL has long been dramatically overstated due to sort of incorrect analysis about their profits and dividends. And because of that shift when they took over the state, it's really changed the ways that they raise money, the ways they fund themselves, and therefore the ability of these different tactics to defund the regime.
Why have you decided to focus on these policies, which may be considered quite controversial?
Well, I think it's really important to understand, how these policies work on a granular level. I think there's a lot of discussion about, sanctions work or sanctions don't work, or companies should divest or companies should stay in Myanmar. But often, it's talked about at a superficial level without getting into, some of the real details about, when we talk about sanctions. If you look at certain aspects of some types of sanctions, it's clear that they have been effective in some ways in disrupting revenue flows to the military, at least temporarily, in forcing the military to find new ways to do things for them to, it takes them time and effort to evade sanctions. But at the same time, sanctions also have limitations. There are things they can't do. For example, once foreign currency comes back to Myanmar, sanctions are pretty limited in their ability to keep the regime from getting access to that foreign currency once it's in Myanmar. And so the point of the article is to have a really nuanced discussion about what has worked and what has changed over the 5 years since the coup, because I think that's also a point that's often not talked about. The way the Myanmar military funds itself now is much different from what it was in 2020. And I think that many people don't fully understand how significant that shift is and what that means for the tactics and the effectiveness of tactics to defund the military.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.